Okay, guys, we're on the American Revolution, and we know prior to this time period, the colonies have been established and they had salutary neglect. They were able to work out their economic endeavors on their own. And we're going to see they establish their own governments in absence of a highly centralized government. But the French and Indian War is going to be that turning point. It's going to shift things from salutary neglect to a highly centralized government. We're going to see the French and Indian War, where it happened. Let me just pull up an image. It happened in this area of the Ohio River Valley. And this war really happened because General Washington had been sent out into this area to stake some claims on some shaky land claims in this area. As he goes out here, he meets with some French troops, shoots them, has signed a treaty, and this will start the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War really gets its name because the French will unite with the Huron Indians, and the colonists and the English will unite with the Iroquois Indians. And this whole skirmish of the war, we see that the English have some advantage. They do have more soldiers. They do have a better navy. We know the French have a smaller population. But we were going to see that this is the greater scope of wars that is going on, and the colonists will help win this war. And this will lead to the French being thrown off the continent, but the French people being allowed to stay here. Most of them are settlers who are trading with the Indians. So the colonists rejoice and they want to move west. But as they move west, the Huron Indians, who had been allies with the French, get really upset and they will begin to attack the colonists. And so what England does is they establish this line called the Proclamation Line of 1763. This line basically tells the colonists that they cannot move west because the British Crown needs to work out issues with the Indian populations to better secure their movement. Again, the English hadn't done much rules. The colonists have been in salutary neglect. And because they're so far away, the colonists are going to continue to move west. And this is an American ideal. They dissent. They don't follow the rules. And it's this whole thing that will set up the American Revolution. Again, without the French and Indian War, salutary neglect would have been going on. We wouldn't have had rules for the colonists to resist. And so one of the things the colonists have been following is mercantilism. And if the colonists were following mercantilism, that means goods would be flowing from England to the colonies. The colonies would have bought those items that had taxes in it, and the crown would have received those revenues. But because the crown is in debt now from the global wars going on, along with the French and Indian War, we're going to see that they're going to look at their colonists that they need to fork over some of it. And a lot of it just through trade. And so the English crown wants to find those who are smuggling because that's preventing them from getting revenue. So the English government is going to pass the writs of assistance, which is a super warrant. It allows any tax revenue agent to go look for the smugglers anywhere, and they don't have to keep on going for the judge. And this is a violation of the rights of an Englishman. Usually, if they were going to get a warrant, they had to continually go up before the judge. And anybody who's found smuggling is going to go into these immorality courts, which they are guilty until they're proven innocent, which is a violation of the rights of an Englishman because usually they're innocent until proven guilty. And they have courts. Within the court, they have a jury. In these courts, it's only the judge. And so many colonists are getting upriled because they feel this is the rights of an Englishman, which they've been guaranteed in their colonial charters. The real event that kickstarts the whole idea that they're being taxed is the Stamp Act. And they're being taxed for legal documents, for stamps, for newspaper, for playing cards. And this tax is really upsetting them because according to the rights of an Englishman, they should have representatives who get to vote on taxation. And they believe that their town halls, the House of Burgesses, and their local governments are the only true people who should be able to tax them. And so this is what's going to lead to the protests and the Stamp Act Congress forming. And they're the ones who are going to start the conversation with the English crown, specifically George III and Parliament, that they should not be able to be taxed by Parliament because they have no one representing them there. They want someone, a representative of the 13 colonies sitting in Parliament. And again, Parliament feels that that's not, their local government is not the only one that should be able to tax them. We're eventually going to see the Sons of Liberty rise up and take down tax collectors and foment the rebellion. Also, the Committee of Correspondence is going to communicate between all of the colonies of the idea that they should combine in a boycott. And these boycotts, what they're going to do is impact the merchants. The merchants are not going to be getting their items bought. This is going to lead to the merchants complaining to the British government. And eventually, the British government will repeal the Stamp Act. And this is a momentary rejoice for the colonies because they learned that if they boycott, they hurt the merchants, Parliament will rebel. And they're going to do this. They will repeal these acts. And they learn to do this every time. And so even though this rejoicing about figuring out how to deal with Parliament is premature, we're going to see that Parliament's going to pass the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act basically says Parliament has the right to tax the colonies because the idea of virtual representation, that everybody in Parliament represents all English individuals, no matter where you are in England, in Australia, in the Americas, in a pineapple under the sea. They represent all British people, no matter where you are. So basically, they've just justified taxation. We're going to see that this leads to the Townshend Acts, which Parliament is going to pass a tax on lead, paint, paper, and tea. This is going to upset the colonists because, again, they feel that Parliament should not tax them without a representative. They feel that only their local legislative bodies have the right to tax them. We're going to see they really get upset about the Townshend Act because it takes away the power of the purse. The colonists used to pay the royal governors. And when the royal governor didn't do what they wanted, they kept his salary to beckon him to do what they pleased. And when the royal governor finally beckoned to their calling, he was paid. The Townshend Act is going to take that away, and now the royal governor is going to have to adhere to what the king wants. And so this is why they're protesting. Not only are they protesting the tax, that it's not coming from their local governments, but they're protesting that it takes away the power of the purse. Eventually, this will hurt the merchants. The merchants will go to Parliament. Parliament will repeal the Townshend Acts, except the 3 cents tax on tea. We know that things are going to get upriled, and Parliament's going to send in most soldiers. And a lot of it is going to stem from the Quartering Act. Even though in the English Bill of Rights it said that the colonists and any English person should not be able to quarter a soldier, the Quartering Act comes around saying that they must. Again, that's a violation of the rights of an Englishman, and this is going to barrel down into the Boston Massacre. The tensions are going to be so high because soldiers are living in the colonists' homes, and this is an open skirmish when the colonists attack the redcoats, and the redcoats fire back, and we have people who die, such as Crispus Attucks. Things will boil over into the Tea Act. Again, the colonists are upset because the tax is a tax they did not get to vote on. The British government does this because the British East India Company is facing bankruptcy and they need to sell their surplus. And instead of going straight to England to collect the tax and then coming to the colonies, they're given the authority to come straight to the colonies, and their boats are coming to the major ports such as New York and Annapolis and Charleston and in Boston. In Boston, y'all know it's the most infamous because they throw the bubbly into the ocean and the fish get tea. But there's other ones that are worse and more egregious, as in Annapolis, where they burn the boat in the water. But again, most of the revolution has been happening in the New England area, and so this is why the Intolerable Acts come out. Oops, sorry guys. The Intolerable Acts come out and punish Boston. They close the port. They require them to pay this. They take away the town meeting. The Intolerable Acts, coupled with the Quebec Act, will lead to that area that they won in the Ohio River Valley in the French and Indian War to being controlled by the British, but giving control to the French citizens there, allowing them to have less rights, allowing them to have the Catholic religion as the dominant religion. And this really hits at the jugular to the colonists because that was the area they won in the French and Indian War. All of this stuff will commence into the First Continental Congress convening to help Boston. And they realized that they're reluctant, right? They're not really revolting, saying peace out, we're done, England. We're seeing that they're being very reluctant, and they realize that if a war was to happen, the colonies mainly have been doing raw materials, and that they need to get stuff to be prepared just in case. And so this is why the colonists go to Lexington and Concord to get weapons. And when they're on their way, the British are there, and the first shots of the American Revolution happen. And this is why the Second Continental Congress is going to convene, because they're fighting and yet they're not organized. And this is when they appoint George Washington. They realize they need more resources, so they go to Ticonderoga. They take the cannons from Ticonderoga and put them on Bunker Hill to stem the invasion of the British coming into the Boston Harbor. Eventually, they won't be able to withstand them, and the British do take Bunker Hill, and the colonists will invade Canada to prevent that from being a basis, and we will see the British will bring in the Haitians, which are the German mercenaries. So they're reluctant. They're not fully revolting until Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, and he talks about how, it makes no sense that people are dying and they're still united with England. It makes no sense that a bigger area is in charge of by a small island. And he looks and he goes through this whole argument of why the colonists are still together. And this will set the foundation for the Declaration of Independence. And here is where they formally agree that they're done. They've tried to reach out with the olive branch. They've tried to make amends, but George III and Parliament don't do this. And the Declaration of Independence is a huge breakup letter. They talk about everything that George III has done, everything that Parliament has done. And again, we know the Declaration of Independence, the whole purpose of it is, yes, it's to list the stuff of what the other party's doing, but it's also to seek aid from other countries in their whole fight, because they do need military weapons and they need aid. We will see that aid will eventually come after the Battle of Saratoga, where the Americans do defeat the British here. And this will lead to the Franco-American Alliance, where France helps them with their navy and some resources and military weapons. And so the Franco-American Alliance will be perpetually paid back by the Americans in World War I and World War II and Vietnam. We will see that the war will shift to the middle colonies and eventually to the southern colonies. The British will come into Yorktown, and they had this whole idea that they would march to the south and get loyalists. And as they're in Yorktown, Cornwallis will get surrounded, and we will see the French Navy will be off the coast and prevent any reinforcements, and so Cornwallis has to surrender. And this will lead to the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris will negotiate the end of the war. It will declare America as independent. It will send the parameters of the Mississippi River in the west to Canada, below Canada as the northern boundary, and the top of Florida being the southern boundary of the United States. We know this will eventually lead to the colonists eventually having the War of 1812, because really the British don't really respect the colonists' independence, because they will still reside on the ocean, on their forts, and they will still impress their soldiers. Amidst the war, the Articles of Confederation is created. It gives more power to it takes away power from the central government and gives it to the states. The Articles of Confederation will create a very weak central government, and the only branch will be the legislative branch. But we'll see that they do some things. They're able to finish the war, negotiate the Treaty of Paris. They also set up the orderly settlement of the West. They get the land ordinance. There was some colonies that had extra land, and it'll be turned over to the federal government. The federal government will then use the sale of this land to pay off debt. And the land ordinance is what divides up the land and sets up the quadrants for selling. And eventually the 16th quadrant, anything sold in that, which will be the county seat, will go into the payment for public education. In 1787, we are going to see that Shays' Rebellion will occur, and these are veterans who are upset that the government has not paid back the revolutionary debt to its veterans, and they're going to march on Washington. And the government does not have a strong military, or it's absence of military, and an absence of an executive to deal with Shays' rebellion. And Shays' rebellion really scares a lot of the wealthy people that their wealth can be taken away. They're not going to say that they come to the constitutional convention because of Shays' rebellion. They're really going to say the issue resides with commerce, that alliteration. The constitutional convention was created for the issues of commerce and to regulate all of that stuff. We also know the Northwest Ordinance is going to be passed at this time, and this is what's going to establish the idea of statehood. First, all territories will be tied to Congress. Once they get 60,000 inhabitants, they can apply for statehood. And the other thing that it's going to do is going to ban slavery in the Northwest Territory. Eventually, this will establish a precedent for Congress that every time that it acquires a new territory, that it will make some ruling on it in dealing with slavery, and this will eventually lead us down the road to the Civil War. We know the background causes of the American Revolution led from the Enlightenment, that people had the right to think about a government and express their discontent, the rights of an Englishman being violated, the new imperial policies such as the proclamation line, the taxes, and this idea that the Americans were a little bit different. What we're going to look at is the Articles of Confederation. We know that when the colonists declared their independence, this will be the first government. The 13 sovereign states created a central government with very limited power. It only had a legislative branch. The state governments had the three branches. They had an executive, which was a governor. They had a court system, and they had a legislative branch of Congress. However, they did not let the central government have an executive because they felt that the executive would kind of feel like a king, which they were going against. And they did not like the courts because, again, those amorality courts left a bad taste in their mouth. We're going to see that the Articles did keep our nation together. And we're going to see it wasn't until the Western lands was given up by the colonies that had more lands that will be accepted by all. We already talked about the land ordinance where they divide up the land that sets the orderly settlement up the West, and that the sale of the 16 quadrant will go for the paying of public education. I talked about the Northwest Ordinance and how its establishment will lead to that all areas tied to Congress, once they get 16,000 inhabitants, they could apply for statehood. And then they abolished slavery in this area. So the Articles had its strengths. It did keep our nation together, but it had major weaknesses, such as the federal government could not regulate trade. It didn't have the sole power to coin money. It could request money from the states to pay back, but most colonies didn't pay. And so our country wasn't able to pay back its debt. Again, Shays' rebellion happened, and we're going to see it put fears in the conservatives. But again, the conservatives are not going to say they've been scared the bejesus out of the veterans. They're really going to say that commerce issues will come in. And we're going to see when they're trying to revise the Articles, they realize that they had to get a unanimous vote. And this is what's going to lead to the convention saying that they should move to scrapping the Articles and creating a new form of government. Some compromises will be occurred at this, and it really stems from how we balance stuff out, because under the Articles of Confederation, every state got one vote. And big states like Virginia didn't like that. So when they're coming with their legislative branch, the Virginia plan is the idea that every state gets representation based on population. However, small states like Virginia really like the Articles of Confederation because they were given one vote. And they were small, so that actually meant that they got a greater voice. And so the New Jersey plan calls for a unicameral legislature, which each state gets equal representation. We are going to see Benjamin Franklin will bring these ideas together, and this will form our legislative branch with a great compromise, where our House of Representatives will be based on population to appease the big states, and to appease the small states, we're going to see that the Senate will be based on equality. Every state gets 2. We're going to see there's some powers exclusive to the House, that they get to choose the president if no majority vote. It happens in the Electoral College. They also get to start any taxing bills, and they get to impeach the president. And we see this will happen in Johnson and Clinton's administration. We also see the Senate, they get to choose the vice president. They get to approve treaties, 2/3 vote. They get to approve the appointments of cabinet members, Supreme Court justices. And we will see that they are the jury for the impeachment. Our next issue really dealt with slavery. The Southerners wanted their slaves to count for full representation. Even though they were not full citizens, the Northerners cried outcry that if this happened, this will give more representation to the South in the House. And so the agreement came around, which will be the 3/5 compromise, that slaves would count as 3/5, which will increase the population of the South in the House. And it's going to abolish the slave trade by 1807, and we're going to see there's going to be a tax assessed on slaves. Many people felt that the institution of slavery was going to die out, but it's revived with the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. We're going to see the 3/5 compromise is going to set the precedent that we could kind of, instead of dealing directly with slavery, we could always lead to these compromises. Eventually, these compromises will lead to the downfall of the Union. We see that 3/5 compromise, I kind of talked about the trade that protected slavery, and that went with that. Again, not all people like this new constitutional convention. And this is what's going to lead to the splitting up of factions. We're going to see the Federalists are going to be the people who support this. They're conservative. They like the big central government. And people such as Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison will write the Federalist Papers. And what they're going to do in these Federalist Papers is explain all these ideas about the Constitution and how there's a sharing of power. The federal government is still superior, but the states do have rights. And we're going to see they explain that the federal government gets to regulate interstate trade. We see that the federal government has the sole power to coin money. And they also explain that this Constitution can be an evolving document because of the idea of the elastic clause, which we know is the necessary preferred clause, that allows Congress to extend the Constitution a little bit to carry out those powers delegated to it. We see that this Constitution will eventually be accepted when 9 of the 13 states agree to it. But these factions have issues, and it's specifically the Anti-Federalists. They did not like this big central government. They wanted states' rights. They wanted it to be for the common man. And they didn't like that this Constitution, and nowhere in it did it have a Bill of Rights. And eventually Madison will promise that his Congress, that's the first thing they will do, and it will be added later. Again, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are not political parties. These factions are just factions in interpretation to the Constitution, and we will see our full political parties created with Hamilton's financial plan and the creation of the bus under Washington's administration.